He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. But somehow, he was always in detention. He missed homework, broke pencils, interrupted class. And when the teacher finally asked why, all he said was, "I don't want to go home yet." But when the school looked deeper, they discovered something no one expected. He wasn't trying to stay out of trouble. He was trying to protect someone else. If stories like this matter to you, please like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And if you've ever had to fight for someone no one else would, tell us in the comments. We read every one. Marcus was small for his age, with big brown eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around him. At 11 years old, he wasn't the kind of kid who caused much trouble in class, so polite that he almost apologized before you had the chance to correct him. Yet there was an inexplicable sadness in those eyes, a sadness that made him shuffle his feet in the hallways and withdraw whenever other students tried to include him in their games. There was something about him that demanded a second glance, but never in a way that made sense, because for all his quiet politeness, he kept landing himself in detention. Not once a month, not on those special occasions where a child's pent-up frustration finally spills over into mischief. Marcus had a detention slip nearly every Friday. It began as a rumor among some of the staff. Teachers would whisper in the break room, "Marcus again? But he's so polite." "You sure?" They had trouble reconciling the repeated slip-ups with the boy they saw day to day. The slip-ups ranged from talking out of turn during afternoon classes to misplacing his homework or wandering into the wrong room. And as soon as anyone confronted him about it, he'd say, "I'm sorry, I messed up," in the softest, most sincere voice, as though his entire being believed he deserved the punishment. School ended at 3 o'clock. Detentions generally ran until 4. That meant an hour of waiting and an hour of mild discipline, usually spent in silence, writing lines, or reflecting on the misbehavior. Most kids dreaded these sessions. They might slump at their desks, roll their eyes, or quietly whisper curses under their breath. Marcus never showed any sign of annoyance or fear. In fact, by the time detention was over, he seemed almost disappointed that he had to leave. And that alone left an unsettling question in the teachers' minds. Mr. Gaines, the principal, was a man with keen observation skills. He was tall and unassumingly kind, with a gentle way of handling discipline that often coaxed the truth out of students who were otherwise too frightened or stubborn to speak. After months of signing off on detention slips with Marcus's name, he started to investigate. He noticed the pattern. All of Marcus's problems flared up in the afternoon, right after lunch. In the mornings, the boy was either silent or politely attentive. By mid-afternoon, something triggered a series of small but consistent behaviors that led to detention. It was Ms. Rivas, the homeroom teacher, who first proposed that maybe Marcus had trouble adjusting. After all, he was in a new foster home, his third in the last year alone, and it wasn't hard to imagine the emotional toll that might take. But something about the severity and consistency of his missteps didn't feel random to Mr. Gaines. He pressed Ms. Rivas for details of Marcus's daily habits, his behavior, any slip in mood or energy that might point to a deeper issue. She couldn't provide a definitive answer. She only mentioned that Marcus clammed up whenever personal topics arose. Still, Mr. Gaines kept his eyes open. He sometimes wandered the halls after the last bell, making sure everything was running smoothly. One day, well past the final bell, he found Marcus sitting outside the detention room an hour early, quietly watching the clock. The boy was holding a peanut butter sandwich he'd barely touched, staring off into space as if the hallway itself was a sanctuary he didn't want to leave. "Marcus," Mr. Gaines said gently, "detention doesn't start for another hour. Why are you here so early?" Marcus blinked, like someone roused from a light doze. He mumbled an apology, "I messed up again," and dropped his gaze to the floor. Mr. Gaines tried to press further, but the boy closed up like a locked box. Something was very wrong. It was as though Marcus was using these punishments to hide, or at least to avoid something else. As the days went by, Mr. Gaines began to suspect that the trouble was not inside the school, but rather what waited for Marcus once he left. That suspicion grew into near certainty one morning, when Marcus came to school with a fresh bruise on his arm. He tried to pull his sweater over it, but the discolored skin was clear to Mr. Gaines. The boy insisted he'd fallen during dodgeball. But Ms. Rivas and the PE teacher both confirmed he hadn't attended PE for 2 days due to a scheduling conflict. Marcus was lying, or at least avoiding the truth, and every adult who cared to look could see he was frightened. The school counselor, Ms. Ramirez, flagged the bruise. She documented it, asked Marcus some open-ended questions, gently prodded. But a counselor couldn't do much without substantial confirmation. Marcus was resolute in his explanation. "I tripped," he said, not meeting her eyes. He was the picture of a boy who desperately wanted to speak up, but refused to say the words. In the teacher's lounge, Mr. Gaines pored over Marcus's file. The boy had bounced from one foster placement to another. Finally, he was assigned to a high-stability household with a married couple, the Hales, who had 2 teenage children of their own. Everything looked good on paper. There were no prior complaints, no red flags in the background checks, no violation in the monthly home visits. Marcus's younger sister, Sabrina, was also living there. She was in a different grade at a different school. All in all, it seemed, officially, like an excellent environment for them. But a missing puzzle piece gnawed at Mr. Gaines. He decided to scan the security footage from the school hallways. Repeatedly, Marcus lingered long after the end of the day. He wandered from one corridor to another, sometimes stalling in the bathroom or the janitor's closet. Just a boy trying to avoid leaving. The question was why? The tension intensified when, one afternoon, Marcus left his backpack in Ms. Rivas's room. It was found by another teacher who, thinking it belonged to her own student, opened it. Inside, folded neatly into a small paper towel, was a note scribbled on lined paper in faint pencil. "If they find this, I lose her. But if I wait too long, he hurts me worse." The teacher who found it felt a chill run down her spine. She immediately turned the note over to Mr. Gaines. No names were mentioned, no direct accusations made, but the meaning was heartbreakingly clear. This boy was protecting someone, most likely his little sister, and he was being abused by an unidentified he. Mr. Gaines hurried to Ms. Ramirez, the counselor, and from there, they contacted Child Protective Services. The phone call came from an official concern over Marcus's well-being, but also from that cryptic note. CPS visited the Hales' home that week. By all accounts, it appeared spotless. The father, Greg Hale, was polite and cooperative. The mother, Linda Hale, was warm, offering coffee and brownies to the investigators. Their 2 teenage kids seemed well-adjusted, though quiet. Marcus's sister, Sabrina, who was just 7, was timid but gave the standard answers about how everything's fine. Marcus himself barely spoke. Nothing about that surface picture gave CPS enough reason to remove the children on the spot. But the next day, a neighbor approached a social worker who had come back to the neighborhood for a routine follow-up. Quietly, the neighbor confided that a 3rd teenager, taller, older, with a swagger that suggested he didn't belong in the house, had been seen entering the Hales' home almost daily, often in the late afternoon or evenings. He was never introduced to the neighbors, and the neighbor had heard raised voices from the basement area more than once. The social worker noted this tip, thanked the neighbor, and decided to make another unannounced visit. That's when they found him. A man in his late teens or early 20s who claimed to be the Hales' cousin. He was staying in the basement. He wasn't on the official foster care documents. No background check had been done. Under the standard arrangement, this was absolutely not allowed. The presence of unapproved adults around foster children was a violation of the licensing agreement. And that was only the start of the problem. It turned out that this cousin was the primary source of Marcus's bruises and terror. He was controlling Marcus through intimidation, through explicit threats that if Marcus said anything about the abuse, the cousin, and, apparently, the foster parents themselves, would ensure that Sabrina was taken away to a far worse place. The cousin had also convinced Marcus that if he misbehaved at school, that might help keep him under the radar, because the boy would look like a problematic foster kid. It was the cousin's twisted logic. A kid who always got in trouble might not be believed if he suddenly made accusations, or so the cousin made him think. Worst of all, the Hales knew about it. They were letting their cousin stay there rent-free and turning a blind eye to the terror he inflicted on Marcus because they wanted the monthly check from fostering the siblings. They threatened that they'd call the agency themselves and speak ill of Marcus if he tried to expose them, thus ensuring he and his sister would be separated. For Marcus, that was worse than any bruise on his arm or any harsh words. He couldn't lose Sabrina. She was all he had left of his biological family, the only anchor that reminded him of the loving home he once had, however fleeting that memory might have been. After the neighbor's testimony and the social worker's discovery, the authorities acted quickly. In the middle of that night, CPS, accompanied by the police, removed Marcus and Sabrina from the Hales' home. The cousin was arrested for child endangerment, assault, and additional charges. The Hales themselves lost their foster license and were charged with fraud and endangerment. It was a horrifying revelation for the entire community, especially for the school staff who had grown to care for Marcus in the only environment where he felt a measure of safety, those detention rooms. In the immediate aftermath, Marcus was placed with Mr. Gaines himself for a short time. The principal had become an unofficial advocate for the boy, and in a surprising twist, Mr. Gaines decided to become Marcus's temporary guardian through a district liaison program until a stable, permanent solution could be found. 3 months later, a more lasting arrangement was reached. Mr. Gaines applied to foster both Marcus and Sabrina in his home, ensuring they wouldn't be separated. On their first day back at school, Marcus led his sister by the hand. He walked straight to the detention room where he had spent so many hours, and sat down at one of the desks. When Mr. Gaines found him there, Marcus only whispered, "It still feels safe in here. But now, I get to go home too." That was the overview of what happened. But the long, grueling story behind it, the heartbreak, the fierce loyalty Marcus showed, the moral dilemmas faced by teachers, administrators, and social workers, was far more complex and took months to unfold. What follows is that story in detail, from the moment the first hints of trouble appeared on Marcus's skin, to the final night when 2 terrified siblings were brought out of a dark basement and into the hopeful dawn of a better life. Marcus's earliest weeks at the new foster home had been, in his words, fine. He had come from a place that was loud and chaotic. There was a foster mother who yelled all the time, not necessarily at him or Sabrina, but enough to make him constantly anxious. The second home had been calmer, but their arrangement fell through when the foster parents separated and the mother moved out of state. So now, at the Hales house, by comparison, everything seemed stable at first glance. Greg and Linda Hale lived in a neatly manicured suburban area with wide sidewalks and friendly neighbors who waved from their porches. Their teenage kids, one 16, the other 14, mostly kept to themselves. The big living room had plush furniture and a fireplace. The kitchen always smelled of pot roast or fresh-baked cookies. What child wouldn't feel safe there? Marcus realized something was off after his first few nights. The cousin showed up. His name was Darren, though Marcus was told to call him Cousin Darren, as if that familial title carried some respect or authority. Darren was 19 and tall, with a wiry frame that seemed coiled with tension. From the moment Marcus laid eyes on him, the vibe in the house changed. Darren had a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, a smirk that hinted at meanness. He would give Marcus's shoulder a squeeze that lingered, pressing just a bit too hard, as if testing the boy's limits. Even at 11, Marcus sensed something menacing behind the forced smiles and half-hearted welcomes. At first, Linda Hale tried to dismiss the tension. She told Marcus, "He's family. He's going through a rough patch and just needs a place to stay. You understand, right?" Marcus nodded obediently because that was his usual way, agreeable and polite. But the next day, after school, Darren cornered him in the hallway leading to the basement stairs and asked Marcus if he had any money. "No, sir," Marcus said, his voice trembling. He never had an allowance. He barely knew what it was like to have pocket change. Darren leaned in close, his breath hot against Marcus's ear. "Don't call me sir," he snapped. "You better learn to speak right." That was all he said, but it dripped with threat. Marcus spent the rest of that evening quietly helping Sabrina with her homework, the two of them huddled in their shared bedroom that smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. He tried to push Darren from his mind. He told himself it was just tension, that Darren was having a bad day, that maybe tomorrow would be better. For a week or so, it seemed like a normal existence. Marcus went to school, missed a few pieces of homework because he was still adjusting, but nothing major. Then came the second encounter, which carved fear into his bones. Darren cornered him again on the day Linda Hale took her teenage children to some extracurricular event, leaving Marcus and Sabrina alone with him. "Where's your sister?" Darren asked casually as he hovered in the living room, flipping through TV channels. Marcus tensed. "She's in her room, drawing." Darren turned the TV off. "Let's have a talk. I hear your caseworker is coming around next week. You're gonna say everything is great here. Got it?" Marcus nodded hesitantly. "Yes. Everything is good." "That's right, it is. But if you say otherwise, if you even hint that you don't like living here, you know what happens." Marcus shook his head. Darren's mouth curved into a predatory smile. "I'll make sure your sister gets taken away from you. I'll tell them you're dangerous, that you can't be trusted. You want that?" Marcus's eyes filled with tears he dared not let fall. He shook his head more fiercely now. "No. Please." "Then keep your mouth shut," Darren said. "I'm here for a while, and you're not gonna mess that up. You got that?" He punctuated his words by gripping Marcus's arm. That was the first bruise, a black and blue outline of Darren's fingers on Marcus's soft skin. After that incident, Marcus did everything he could to stay out of the house. He joined after-school clubs he wasn't interested in, lingered in the cafeteria, and even discovered that detention could keep him on campus a full extra hour without raising suspicion. He tested the waters by getting himself a single detention, intentionally talking out of turn in Ms. Rivas's class. The disappointment in her eyes stung him, but it was better than going home to face Darren. He was ashamed that he was letting his teachers down, but his logic was unwavering. An hour of detention was an hour safer than being alone with that looming threat in the basement. And if it made him look more rebellious or incompetent, well, that might also discourage any direct confrontation from the Hales about whether he was behaving well enough to stay. He played a twisted game of sabotage, appear just problematic enough to dodge extra scrutiny from certain corners, but not so problematic that the authorities might come in and separate him from Sabrina. So the detention routine began. Marcus would do minor infractions, missing homework, wandering into the wrong classroom. Each time, he apologized quickly and profoundly, going so far as to appear frightened of any stern words. Teachers couldn't figure it out. Why would this sweet boy sabotage himself so regularly, especially in the latter half of the day? But they had no direct evidence of anything sinister, and so, for a while, he slipped through the cracks. At night, Marcus endured the occasional intimidation from Darren. Sometimes, it was just a glare or an insinuation that if Marcus stepped out of line, bad things would happen. Other times, when Linda and Greg were out, Darren would forcibly push Marcus around, demanding to know if he had told anyone about him. "You keep your mouth shut," he'd hiss, "or I'll do more than bruise your arm." On 2 occasions, Darren threatened Sabrina directly, telling Marcus that accidents happen to little girls all the time, so it'd be a shame if she was left unguarded somewhere. The threat never needed to be spelled out further for Marcus to feel terror slicing through his heart. Greg and Linda Hale knew. On multiple nights, Marcus heard them quietly talking in their bedroom. Once, Linda said, "He's better off not making trouble. We don't want him messing things up for your cousin." Another time, Greg scolded Darren in a low voice, "Stop leaving marks on him. You're gonna get us all in trouble." But they didn't truly put a stop to it. They only cautioned Darren to be more discreet. The monthly checks arrived for fostering 2 children, money that presumably helped offset the mortgage or gave them more wiggle room in the budget. And it was easy enough to keep up a show of normalcy for the scheduled visits from the caseworker, especially with Marcus too afraid to speak and Sabrina still too little to understand what was truly going on. Meanwhile, at school, Ms. Rivas remained perplexed by Marcus's daily decline in behavior. She invited him to eat lunch in her classroom several times, trying to coax out a reason for his shift. He would only say he was sorry for being a bother, apologizing more than any child should. She tried to check his arms, noticed a few faint bruises, but each time he had a ready excuse. "I fell off my bike," or "I bumped into a desk." She couldn't force the issue. Still, she did mention it to the counselor, Ms. Ramirez, who made a note of the repeated bruises. Marcus's sister, Sabrina, was in a separate elementary school building across the district. Her experiences were different. She was teased sometimes by other kids, but never physically harmed. She had no reason to suspect the basement was anything more than Darren's personal space. Sabrina was too young to pick up on every whispered argument or the tension in Marcus's posture when he stepped foot in the house. Things came to a head the day Marcus forgot his backpack in Ms. Rivas's room. He was in a rush to get to detention, another self-imposed punishment, when Ms. Rivas called after him, "Marcus, your bag." But he had already disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, Ms. Jennings, a math teacher from the next room, walked in and thought the backpack belonged to one of her own students. She opened it to see if it had a name on the inside. That's when she found the note, half hidden in a folded paper towel along with a stub of a pencil. "If they find this, I lose her. But if I wait too long, he hurts me worse." Those words lodged in Ms. Jennings's mind like a shard of ice. She immediately brought the bag to Mr. Gaines. He and Ms. Ramirez read it together, trying to interpret the ambiguous reference to her and he. It was obviously a cry for help, but from whom? The neatness of the handwriting suggested it was, indeed, from Marcus, who had a habit of writing in small, tidy letters. The mention of losing her could only mean Sabrina, though they didn't know her name at the time. The phrase, "hurts me worse," clarified that someone in Marcus's orbit was actively abusing him. The puzzle pieces, in that moment, snapped into place for Mr. Gaines. The phone call to Child Protective Services came next. CPS responded quickly, but the Hales had been through the system checks before. They presented a calm, collected household. Darren wasn't around for that first visit. Linda said he was a friend's son who had just stopped by for dinner the other night. CPS didn't find any immediate evidence to remove the children. They made a note that the household included more people than initially listed, which was suspicious, but not in itself enough to break a placement if the child insisted nothing was wrong. Marcus watched all of this from a distance. He saw the official car outside, saw the social worker enter the house, and froze. Darren approached him afterward, voice low and dangerous. "They come back again," he said, "and you'd better keep your mouth shut. You know what'll happen if you don't." Marcus nodded woodenly, tears brimming but not falling. That night, Linda Hale confronted Marcus in the living room. She put on a kindly face, the one she used for official visits, and said, "Marcus, dear, we know you have trouble adjusting. But if you ever cause us problems with these silly rumors, your sister is going to have to be placed somewhere else. People might say you need special treatment. Isn't that right, Greg?" Greg nodded from the recliner. "That's right, Linda. We'd hate for that to happen." Marcus stared at them in disbelief. The betrayal cut deep. Weren't foster parents supposed to protect you? They offered no comfort, just an unspoken threat that if he didn't toe the line, Sabrina would pay the price. With nowhere else to go, no extended family who could swoop in and save him, Marcus felt trapped. And so he went to school the next day with new bruises on his arm, new cuts on his heart. He apologized for everything, stayed silent, and took yet another detention. But the staff was no longer fooled. They had the note, they had the bruise logs, and they had a reason to dig deeper. The real breakthrough arrived in the form of a neighbor named Mrs. Gunderson, a retired nurse who noticed a pattern of screaming and slamming doors in the Hales' basement on certain evenings. She also saw that an older teen, who didn't look like a typical high school kid, came and went at odd hours. When the same CPS worker came around a second time, following up on the family friend mention, Mrs. Gunderson waved her down. She hesitated, an older woman who disliked gossip, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent, not with an odd feeling about the Hales arrangement. So she told the worker everything she'd seen and heard. That tip was the final piece of evidence required for an unannounced check. Darren was found downstairs, half asleep on a couch, with a dirty blanket and a half-empty bottle of something strong on the coffee table. The sight of CPS and 2 police officers in the basement lit a spark of rage in him. He started shouting, demanding they leave, claiming they had no right. But they did. He wasn't supposed to be there, and they had probable cause to investigate. One of the officers noticed the bruising on Marcus's forearm, fresh marks that matched the shape of Darren's hand. After a tense hour of questioning, Greg and Linda Hale admitted that Darren had been living there for a while and that they'd let him watch Marcus and Sabrina on multiple occasions. The situation was exactly what it seemed, an unvetted adult exerting power over a vulnerable foster child. As the story unraveled further, Darren was arrested on the spot when they learned of the physical abuse. More charges would follow once the children were medically examined and more details emerged. Marcus and Sabrina were taken that same night to a CPS facility. The siblings sat side by side, gripping each other's hands tightly, as a social worker gently explained that they couldn't remain with the Hales. The fear in Marcus's eyes was unmistakable. "Where will we go?" he asked. He didn't cry, he felt too numb to cry. His arms still hurt from Darren's grip, but in his mind, the sharper pain was the uncertainty of what would happen to Sabrina. Would they be separated in the system? Would they bounce from home to home again? To his amazement, the answer came from a kindly voice in the hallway, "With me, if that's all right." It was Mr. Gaines, flanked by Ms. Ramirez and a district liaison. He had taken a personal interest in Marcus's situation from the beginning, but even that night, no one expected him to step in as a temporary foster parent. The social worker explained that while it was unorthodox, the district had a special short-term arrangement for children in crisis when no immediate family was available. Mr. Gaines was single in his late 40s, with a stable income and a respectful reputation. He volunteered on the spot. Marcus's eyes welled up with tears of relief, something he hadn't permitted himself to feel in so long. He clutched Sabrina's hand. She blinked, confused, not quite understanding the gravity, but comforted by Mr. Gaines's warm, reassuring presence. "You're the principal," she said, her small voice trembling. Mr. Gaines smiled gently. "I am. And now I'm going to make sure you two are safe." For the next 3 months, the world turned upside down for Marcus. Instead of a cold suburban home with locked basement doors and a lurking threat, he found himself in a modest bungalow near the city's edge, where Mr. Gaines lived alone. It wasn't a fancy place, a single-story house with 2 bedrooms and a small, fenced yard, but it was quiet, safe, and free of secrets. Each day, Marcus and Sabrina woke up to see Mr. Gaines making breakfast, sometimes with a comedic flair that made them giggle. He joked that he wasn't a master chef, but he was pretty good at scrambled eggs. They had simple dinners around a small dining table, and every weekend, Mr. Gaines took them to the park or let them choose a DVD to watch on his slightly outdated television set. For Sabrina, the transformation was immediate. She blossomed into a playful 7-year-old who giggled at cartoons and told Mr. Gaines about her day at school. Marcus, however, took longer to unwind. He flinched at sudden movements, apologized incessantly for minor mistakes, and often had nightmares that woke him in the middle of the night, breathless and wide-eyed. Mr. Gaines, sensing the depth of his trauma, would sit with him, sometimes just offering a presence so Marcus wouldn't feel alone. Slowly, the lines of tension in Marcus's face began to ease. He started to do his homework on time, no longer sabotaging himself. He joined an after-school club for computer coding, something that had always fascinated him, but now he did it for the enjoyment, not to avoid going home. If he stayed late on campus, it was because he wanted to, not because he feared crossing a threshold back into an abusive environment. During those 3 months, an official investigation took place regarding the Hales. Darren faced multiple counts of child endangerment, assault, and additional charges related to threatening a minor. Greg and Linda Hale were charged with neglect, endangerment, and foster care fraud, given they had knowingly harbored an unapproved adult. Marcus and Sabrina each underwent medical evaluations, therapy sessions, and repeated interviews with social workers. The bruises and statements corroborated the story. Both children's testimonies were consistent. Darren used fear, intimidation, and physical violence, and the Hales not only allowed it but threatened to separate the siblings if Marcus resisted. Eventually, the case led to Darren's conviction. He pled guilty in a deal that avoided a jury trial, likely at the urging of his lawyer. Greg and Linda received lesser sentences but lost their foster license permanently and were placed on probation. They also faced civil penalties. The check that had lured them into fostering for profit was now replaced with fines and a tarnished reputation in the community. Throughout this ordeal, Ms. Rivas, Ms. Ramirez, and the rest of the school staff supported Marcus quietly and compassionately. For the first time, he found himself at the center of gentle, benevolent attention rather than the accusatory stares he used to get whenever he missed a class on purpose. The staff even organized a small fundraiser to help with any immediate needs for Marcus and Sabrina, collecting gift cards, school supplies, and clothes. A new question emerged. Where would Marcus and Sabrina end up after the short-term arrangement with Mr. Gaines concluded? Typically, children would be placed in another foster home, or in a group home if an appropriate family wasn't found. But Mr. Gaines found himself growing deeply attached to these two kids. He'd always wanted children of his own, but life had gone in a different direction, focusing on his career, the demands of being a principal. Now, with Marcus's intelligence and Sabrina's bubbly laugh filling his once quiet home, he realized he might be the person who could offer them a stable life. After many discussions with social workers, after showing proof that he was financially and emotionally equipped to care for them, Mr. Gaines made the decision to apply for a more permanent foster arrangement with the possibility of adopting them later on. Bureaucracy took time, of course, but he pushed through the necessary steps. When the day finally came for the children to return to school, they had taken a short break for therapy and to handle the court matters. They arrived hand in hand. Marcus, who once walked the halls in perpetual shame, lifted his chin slightly higher. He noticed Ms. Rivas looking at him in surprise and relief. Sabrina clung to his side, marveling at how big the middle school corridors seemed compared to her elementary building. Mr. Gaines had arranged for Sabrina to transfer to a nearby elementary school for convenience, but she still wanted to see where her brother learned every day. So, on that morning, she accompanied him briefly before going to her own new classroom. Marcus paused near the detention room. Despite everything, he felt a sense of solace there. It had once been his haven, a place to hide from the darkness at home. Now, it was a symbol of how far he had come. He sat down in one of those old, creaky chairs, the ones lined up in a row by the far window. Mr. Gaines poked his head in. "Marcus? You okay?" Marcus nodded, exhaling a slow breath. "Yeah," he said. "It still feels safe in here. But now, I get to go home too." He meant it. The words resonated in that musty room, a testimony to what he had endured and how he had survived. That was the general outline you might have heard. But the devil, as they say, is in the details, and those details include fear-filled nights, heated discussions between educators, the complicated web of social services, and the unwavering commitment of a few good people who refuse to let a child's pain go unnoticed. If you want the entire story, from the very first hints of trouble to the final rescue and beyond, you have to look at how each character played a role, intentionally or not, in bringing about the confrontation that finally saved Marcus and Sabrina. In the weeks leading up to the rescue, Ms. Rivas was close to tearing her hair out with concern. She spent her lunchtimes in the staff lounge, discussing Marcus with Ms. Ramirez. The counselor, similarly troubled, tried multiple strategies to get him to open up. She had him draw pictures, write short stories, or keep a small journal for feelings. All standard counselor approaches for a child who might be bottling up stress. But each time Marcus veered too close to revealing the truth, he panicked. Ms. Ramirez could see the fear in his eyes. She suspected a threat or intimidation, but without evidence, she couldn't forcibly extract a confession. Meanwhile, Mr. Gaines juggled responsibilities as principal. He oversaw the entire student body, dealt with budget concerns, staff morale, and the usual discipline issues that come with running a school of hundreds of preteens and teens. Yet he found himself constantly drawn back to that quiet boy who seemed determined to remain in detention. Each time Mr. Gaines encountered Marcus in the halls, he asked a pointed question: "How are things at home? Are you feeling all right? You know you can talk to me, right?" And each time, Marcus mumbled something indistinct, eyes to the ground, as if carrying an invisible weight. One afternoon, Mr. Gaines called Ms. Rivas into his office. "I need you to give me every detail you can about Marcus's day. Everything you've observed." She hesitated at first, worried it might violate the boy's privacy. But Mr. Gaines clarified that this was a matter of suspected abuse, which teachers were mandated by law to report if they had reason to believe a child was being harmed. Ms. Rivas described how Marcus's demeanor worsened as the day went on. He frequently looked at the clock, especially after lunchtime, fidgeting nervously. He became restless in classes that occurred after noon. And he always seemed to find ways to earn small infractions just enough to land a detention. "That can't be coincidence," Mr. Gaines murmured. "He wants detention. He wants to stay here as long as possible." "Because the alternative is going home," Ms. Rivas said grimly. They both sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Then Mr. Gaines asked Ms. Rivas to keep a closer watch. "I'm going to do some investigating of my own," he said. That investigation led him to the security footage, where he confirmed that Marcus sometimes hid in the janitor's closet. Other times simply walked the halls until a teacher caught him. It was as if the boy believed the moment the final bell rang. A clock began ticking down to something dreadful. While Mr. Gaines combed the footage, Ms. Ramirez tried to glean more from Marcus in her counseling sessions. She introduced him to art therapy, letting him color scenes or doodle shapes. Often, children who suffer from trauma express themselves in coded ways on paper. Marcus was no exception. He drew pictures of a house with a dark, shadowy figure looming behind a smaller figure. Another time, he drew two children holding hands, one bigger child and one smaller child, with a thick line around them as if they were encased in a protective bubble. The bubble, however, was being pressed from outside by a long, spidery shape. Ms. Ramirez gently asked, "Can you tell me who the smaller child is?" Marcus nodded. "That's my sister," he whispered. "And the bigger one is me." But when she asked about the spidery figure, Marcus shut down. He shook his head and wouldn't say more. Still, Ms. Ramirez marked these drawings as further evidence for concern. The tension in the staff lounge escalated as well. Teachers who had given Marcus detention began to compare notes. "He's never rude about it," said one. "He's so polite it's almost heartbreaking." Another teacher confessed she never actually witnessed a disruption from Marcus. She had simply found him wandering around the hall after the bell, looking lost. When confronted, he apologized and accepted the detention slip without protest. Eventually, the slip with the cryptic message was found in his backpack. That changed everything. Mr. Gaines and Ms. Ramirez realized they had enough suspicion to contact CPS. The social worker assigned was new to the district. She performed the standard interview at the Hales home, but aside from noticing the presence of an unfamiliar older teen in a photograph, she didn't see anything that warranted immediate removal. She explained to Mr. Gaines that a bruise alone, without a statement from the child or additional proof, wasn't enough to override the foster parents' claims of accident or typical roughhousing. Marcus, upon seeing that the visit concluded with no immediate action taken, fell into deeper despair. He believed that Darren was unstoppable, that the authorities would always be fooled by the Hales orchestrated facade. Over the next few days, he grew more withdrawn. He scurried from class to class, always hugging the walls, trying not to be noticed. People recognized that something was terribly wrong but felt powerless to address it head-on. One surprising ally emerged during this time, a 7th-grade girl named Jade, who shared a math class with Marcus. She was a quiet honor roll student, known for her thick glasses and love of library books. Jade had once offered Marcus a seat at her table, noticing he tended to sit alone. He refused politely, too preoccupied by his own worries, but Jade paid attention. She saw him flinch whenever someone made a sudden move near him. She saw how, in group projects, he apologized even if he did nothing wrong. One day, she mustered the courage to ask, "Marcus, are you okay? You look sad all the time." Marcus forced a small smile. "I'm fine. Just tired." Jade studied him. "You can tell me if something's wrong, you know. I won't laugh." He swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said. "But I'm fine." She didn't press further. She simply nodded, respecting his boundaries. But over the next few days, she noticed a bruise on his wrist, and then another near his collarbone. She quietly reported her concerns to Ms. Rivas. Although Ms. Rivas already knew, the fact that a classmate had noticed too added weight to the overall alarm the teachers felt. They were building a case, piece by piece. so that when they contacted CPS again, they could present stronger evidence. Meanwhile, the real threat at home escalated. Darren, aware that investigators had visited once already, grew more paranoid. He pounded on Marcus's door late at night, hissing that if the boy said a word to them again, Sabrina would suffer. The tension soared to a fever pitch, culminating in one horrifying evening when Sabrina accidentally spilled a glass of juice near Darren's belongings in the basement. Darren erupted in a rage. He shoved Sabrina away, yelling at her. Marcus intervened, screaming, "Stop!" Darren grabbed Marcus by the shirt, slammed him against the wall, and spat, "You do not speak to me like that." The bruise left behind was large and unmistakable. Linda Hale, emerging from upstairs, only gave a short gasp, then demanded they keep it down so the neighbors wouldn't hear. She didn't comfort Sabrina. She didn't check Marcus's injuries. She just insisted they be quieter. Marcus spent the night with tears in his eyes, pressing a damp cloth to the swelling on his shoulder. He reminded Sabrina over and over that he wouldn't let Darren hurt her again, but Sabrina, still shaken, could only nod. The next morning, Marcus put on a shirt that covered the bruise. He said nothing to Ms. Rivas, Ms. Ramirez, or Mr. Gaines. But the fear in his eyes was enough that Ms. Ramirez decided to discreetly request another CPS visit. This time, the neighbors' input sealed the deal. Mrs. Gunderson had retired from nursing a decade prior, but she was nobody's fool. She recognized the signs of stress in a household that was hiding something. She'd seen Darren lurking around, heard muffled yelling from the basement. She'd even once glimpsed Marcus stepping outside with an ashen face, trembling from head to toe, as if he'd just escaped a blow. So when the social worker came by again, Mrs. Gunderson marched right out of her front door, flagged her down, and delivered her concerns in a calm but resolute manner. That was enough to spur immediate action. The unannounced visit that followed caught the family off guard. When the police and CPS entered the Hales' home, Linda tried to maintain her veneer of hospitality. Greg stood in the background, jaw clenched. But it was Darren who panicked. He emerged from the basement, confronting the officers, demanding they leave. When they insisted on talking to Marcus in private, Darren's anger flared. He tried to yank the door shut to the basement, but an officer stepped forward, blocking him. Marcus and Sabrina were found trembling in their room, Sabrina clutching a teddy bear. Marcus had tears streaking his cheeks but refused to let them fall, as if determined to show some measure of bravery. Then the fresh bruise on his shoulder was spotted. A swirl of events followed: shouts, accusations, Linda's frantic backpedaling. Police escorted Darren out of the house in handcuffs. Greg and Linda were left to protest that, "We had no idea," but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus and Sabrina were loaded into a CPS vehicle. The drive away from that suburban block felt surreal. Sabrina cried softly, burying her face into Marcus's arm. Marcus tried to steady his breathing, but a storm of thoughts twisted in his mind. He feared what would happen next, dreaded the possibility of being separated from Sabrina. Yet he also felt an odd sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't going to spend the night beneath the same roof as Darren. They arrived at a CPS intake center, a modest building with dull, neutral walls and an odd smell, a mix of disinfectant and stale air. Social workers gathered around, offering them blankets, juice, and a quiet room to rest. The sibling pair sat on a small couch, Sabrina half asleep on Marcus's lap. Soon, the door opened, and in walked Mr. Gaines, looking concerned but determined. Marcus stared at him, uncomprehending at first, until the social worker explained the temporary arrangement. Mr. Gaines' eyes shone with compassion. "If you'd like to stay with me for a while," he said, "we can make that happen." He knelt down to meet Marcus's gaze. "I don't want you to be alone in this." Marcus hesitated. He glanced at Sabrina, who stared back with wide eyes. Then he nodded slowly. He could hardly form words. The knot in his throat was so big that speaking felt impossible. But in his heart, gratitude swelled, chasing away the gloom that had overshadowed him for so long. That night, for the first time in months, Marcus slept without listening for Darren's footsteps in the hallway. He slept in a small guest bedroom in Mr. Gaines's house, with Sabrina in the adjacent room. Mr. Gaines had done his best to set them up comfortably, rummaging through his attic for extra sheets, pillows, anything that might make the children feel at home. The next morning, they all sat together at a tiny kitchen table, the worn edges of the tabletop reflecting years of use. Mr. Gaines made scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice. Sabrina ate quietly, still in shock from the abrupt change. Marcus cautiously took each bite, feeling an anxiety he couldn't shake. The principal tried to lighten the mood, telling them stories of his own childhood, about how he once loved to fish with his dad, and how he came to love reading and teaching. Over the following weeks, Mr. Gaines proved to be an unexpected but steady anchor in Marcus's life. He juggled his job as principal with the new demands of caring for 2 foster children. He arranged therapy for them, found out Sabrina liked to sing and enrolled her in a local kids' choir. He discovered Marcus's fascination with computers and connected him with the school's tech club, encouraging him to explore programming. Slowly, the boy who had stoically endured abuse began to open up about his fears, nightmares, and most importantly, his hopes. In one therapy session, Marcus admitted, "I was so scared they would take Sabrina away. I thought I had to handle it alone. That's why I stayed quiet." Mr. Gaines, who sat in the waiting room while Marcus attended his session, was told about the confession afterward. It hit him hard. This 11-year-old had carried the burden of protecting his sister at the cost of his own safety. Mr. Gaines quietly resolved to do everything in his power to keep them together, no matter what obstacles the foster system might throw at them. And there were obstacles: home inspections, financial and background checks, interviews with child welfare officials who questioned whether a single man with a demanding job could handle the responsibility of 2 children, one of whom had significant trauma. But Mr. Gaines was patient and thorough. He cooperated fully, invited the social workers into his home, even introduced them to neighbors who vouched for his character. Step by step, he built the case that Marcus and Sabrina would be safe and loved with him. At school, the difference in Marcus was like night and day. Gone was the boy who lingered in the corridors, skipping out on final bell. Now, he attended classes attentively, participated in group discussions, and occasionally even joined in jokes with classmates. Jade, the quiet girl from math class, approached him again, and this time, he managed a genuine smile. "Thanks for asking about me," he said. "I'm doing better now." Rumors circulated among the student body about how Marcus had been rescued from a bad foster home. Some kids were too shy to ask him directly, others who tried got only a polite deflection. Marcus didn't flaunt his new situation, but neither did he hide behind a wall of fear. He was simply and that was a miraculous change in itself. Meanwhile, Sabrina transferred to a nearby elementary school. When Mr. Gaines drove them both in the morning, Sabrina would wave goodbye to Marcus at the middle school entrance, then ride on to her own building with a new sense of security. She missed some old friends, but she blossomed under the calmer environment at home. Every day when Mr. Gaines picked them up, she hopped into the front seat chattering about songs she learned or pictures she drew. Marcus, quiet in the back seat, would grin hearing her excitement. The official case against Darren moved swiftly by legal standards. He faced strong evidence and, under advice from his public defender, accepted a plea deal that would likely keep him away from Marcus and Sabrina for a long time. Greg and Linda Hale also stood trial for neglect and violating foster care regulations. Their defense was half-hearted. They tried to claim ignorance or minimal involvement, but the documentation and neighbors' testimony painted a damning picture. They lost their license and faced stiff penalties. Through all of this, Mr. Gaines became not just a caretaker, but an advocate for the siblings. He made sure therapy continued, took them to medical checkups, and attended every court hearing. By the time winter melted into spring, it was clear that Marcus and Sabrina had found something resembling a real family, a stable, nurturing environment where they could heal. One sunny morning, after a brief but restful weekend, the 3 of them pulled into the middle school parking lot. Sabrina was in the back seat this time, holding Marcus's hand. She was a bit nervous about meeting some of his friends who knew she was his younger sister. Marcus teased her, "Don't worry, they're just a bunch of middle schoolers. We're weird, but we're not scary." Mr. Gaines parked, turned off the engine, and gave them a reassuring smile. Alright, you two. Big day ahead. Yep, Sabrina chirped. I have an art project, and Marcus said I could come see his coding club after school. That's right, Marcus confirmed, sounding more confident than he ever used to. We're building a little robot that can follow a line on the floor. They hopped out. The sun cast a golden glow on the campus, and a gentle breeze rustled the neatly trimmed hedges. This was the first time Sabrina had been allowed to roam the middle school halls without being rushed. Classes wouldn't start for another 30 minutes, so Marcus guided her around. He showed her the cafeteria, the library with its tall shelves, and the courtyard where older kids often hung out. Then, as if guided by muscle memory, he found himself near the detention room. Sabrina tilted her head. This is where you used to stay after school, right? Marcus nodded. A strange swirl of emotions brewed in his chest. Nostalgia, relief, maybe even gratitude. The door was open, and inside were the same chairs, the same battered desks. A few kids were there already for various reasons, some finishing homework, others assigned morning detention. Marcus ventured in, ignoring the curious stares. He walked to the corner desk, the one he'd always chosen because from there, he could see anyone coming in or out. He remembered the hours of just sitting, waiting, dreading the return home. But that dread was gone now. It's weird, isn't it? He said quietly to Sabrina. For a while, this was the only place I felt safe. She looked around, puzzled. It doesn't seem like much. Marcus let a small laugh escape. Yeah, but it was better than home. He turned to see Mr. Gaines standing in the doorway. A flicker of understanding passed between them. It still feels safe in here, Marcus said in a more subdued voice, but now, I get to go home too. He offered the slightest grin, shy but genuine. Mr. Gaines approached, gently placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. That's right, Marcus. You get to go home. They left the detention room, walking down the hall side by side. The old fear that used to coil in Marcus's stomach was nowhere to be found. In its place was an anticipation of the day ahead, school, coding club, dinner with Mr. Gaines, Sabrina's stories about art class. The normalcy felt extraordinary. Life wasn't magically perfect afterward. Healing from abuse is never a simple journey. Marcus still had bad dreams. Sabrina sometimes woke up crying for reasons she couldn't articulate. Mr. Gaines faced more than a few challenges balancing his professional duties and parenting. There were court appearances, therapy sessions, the slow process of building trust, and the ever-looming possibility that the system might decide to move the children elsewhere. But step by step, with the help of caring adults, the bond between them grew. Each small victory, like Marcus inviting a friend over to the house for the first time, or Sabrina singing a solo line in her kids' choir, felt like a beacon of hope, a sign that their future could be bright despite their dark past. As the months rolled on, the adoption process began. Mr. Gaines had proven himself capable and loving, the children had expressed their desire to stay with him, and the system, for once, aligned with their wishes. The bureaucratic hurdles were still there, but they were surmountable. By the end of the school year, it was clear to most that a new family was forming. Ms. Rivas remarked one afternoon that she saw Marcus in the hallway, laughing with a small group of friends. "I've never seen him so carefree," she told Ms. Ramirez. The counselor nodded in agreement, tears of joy brimming in her eyes. All the heartbreak and frustration they'd experienced while trying to piece together the truth had led to this moment, a boy reclaiming his childhood. And so the cycle of fear finally broke. Marcus remained small for his age, but with a big heart that had endured unimaginable stress. He gradually learned it was okay to speak up, okay to say he was upset or scared, because there were adults who genuinely wanted to help. Sabrina thrived in her new environment, forging friendships and discovering talents she never knew she had. The final confrontation with Darren, Greg, and Linda had been a nightmare, but it became the catalyst that freed the siblings from a far worse future. The entire ordeal highlighted the importance of vigilance and compassion among educators and neighbors who refused to ignore the signs that a child was in trouble. In time, Marcus rarely glanced at the detention room anymore. If he did, it was with a soft nostalgia rather than the frantic longing he once felt. But on that first day back, sitting briefly at that desk, he summarized it best. It was once his only refuge, the only place he felt safe. Now, with Mr. Gaines's arms open in welcome, with Sabrina sleeping peacefully down the hall, with teachers who stood by him, he understood the depth of that transformation. He would never have to hide in a cramped space or court detention just to avoid going home. To any outsider, the change was profound. The shy boy with bruises had blossomed into a more confident student, forging friendships, building small robots in coding club, even daring to raise his hand in class to answer questions without mumbling an apology first. Perhaps the greatest testament to his evolution came one day when Ms. Rivas corrected him on a math assignment. Expecting the old reflexive apology, she braced herself for the usual meltdown. Instead, he nodded and said, "Thanks for explaining, Ms. Rivas. I think I understand now." And that was that. No fear, no trembling, just the ordinary resilience of a child who knew he was safe to make mistakes and learn from them. Those who truly knew his story, teachers, counselors, social workers, felt a surge of pride every time they saw him in the halls. His transformation wasn't just about academic improvement or better behavior, it was the visible proof of a life saved, of a system that, despite its flaws and delays, had ultimately worked because a few good people fought to make it work. When the final word came through that Mr. Gaines was officially approved to foster both Marcus and Sabrina long-term, the staff decided to celebrate. They didn't hold a big party, nothing that would embarrass Marcus. But on the last day of that semester, Ms. Rivas handed Marcus a small congratulatory card. It simply read, "We're so proud of you. We knew how brave you are." Inside, many of the teachers had written short messages or well wishes. Ms. Ramirez wrote, "You're stronger than you'll ever know." Ms. Jennings, the teacher who accidentally found the note, wrote, "So glad I opened that backpack." Marcus read each note slowly, tears pricking his eyes. He slipped the card into his new backpack, the one with a small, embroidered patch of a robot on the front, a gift from Mr. Gaines. He never wanted to forget these teachers and staff members who had believed in him when he couldn't speak for himself. Sabrina, on the other hand, delighted in telling everyone about their new living arrangement. "We have a yard now," she'd say excitedly. "And Mr. Gaines planted flowers, and we each have our own room, and my brother's not sad anymore." Her childlike exuberance was enough to draw smiles from everyone around her. The sight of her bounding through the halls, free from the specter of Darren's threats, was like sunshine after a relentless storm. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It helps us reach more people who care. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And if you've ever had to fight for someone no one else would, tell us in the comments. We read every one.